folks. This is Tom Horn. I am just so excited. My best friend, for 10 years or more, we were just talking about this off the air, Steve Quayle. Great to have you inside the studio today.
Well, thanks, Tom. I feel like we're so familiar with each other, even though we've never met. It's exciting for me to be able to share our mutual interests, our mutual investigation, and talk about what I believe and you believe are the most relevant issues today.
You know, I was just telling somebody yesterday that I think this is probably the most overlooked aspect of end times Bible prophecy, a subject that has to do with doorways, portals, gateways of the earth, and the things that are behind them and the things that have come through them throughout time. And it's amazing. You've said this before, how sometimes you'll be tracking on a subject matter at the same time I'm tracking on a subject matter somewhere else, and we'll come together to do radio only to find out we've both been being led by the Lord to talk about the same subject matter. And this time, of course, you've written this book. We're going to be talking about it. The Gates of Hell Are Opening. What's this about, and why did you write it?
Well, first of all, I got to credit you probably for the one that, when I was interviewing you on the radio, I don't know what, maybe 6-7 years ago, you brought up the gates of hell and when you were writing the Armand Gate. And up until that point, it hadn't clicked. I never put in the context the gates of hell along with the Armand Gate and the whole portal opening and the whole revelation of creatures, of entities that have been blocked from coming into our dimension, our domain, by a loving God for our own safety. And it's fascinating, Tom. The reason I wrote this is because you can't escape the fact now that when America walked in the ways of the Lord, the living God, when we honored God, there was a whole different feel in those days, and we didn't have to deal with what we're dealing. We weren't listening in those days to the most famous actresses of their day, or some of the most, talking about having sex with demons. Mm-hmm. Well, in order to deal with the whole idea of incubus and succubus, those are medieval terms that even go back 4,000 years. Most Christians would be probably startled to understand the 91st Psalm, the terror that comes by night. That was Lilith the night hag, and that was a shapeshifter. So by bringing out the gates of hell are opening, our parallel investigations, there's no way to escape it, whether it's Native American, whether it's Indo-European, whether it's Asian, whether it's Australian. Everybody in every single culture talks about the doorway of the gods or the presence of evil ones coming through the portals. The point that people must understand is symbols have meaning. And as those symbols are represented throughout the world, you can't get away from the gates of hell. Most people would be very surprised, if not shocked, if they even took the basis of some of the children's fairy tales, whether it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, whether it's Rose Red, whether it's Rumpelstiltskin, all of these things that the brothers Grimm wrote about, between, I think, 1817 and 1854, they went through the European continent, basically chronicling all of these strange encounters. Now, we're talking about famous people that believed in little creatures and wrote about them. For instance, most people, Robert Louis Stevenson, well, they know he wrote Treasure Island, but they don't know that, according to his word, an elf, if you will, gave him the plot for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Most people don't know that Socrates gave credit to the daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N in Greek, the demon that gave him intellect that everyone still respects today. The interesting thing about little creatures is I found no indication where they were ever kind, benevolent, or wonderful that the children's portrayal in storybooks has made them out to be. On the contrary, obviously, Walt Disney introduced a lot of very dark concepts through the children's fairy tales, that he made the cartoons over, and the extended cartoons, like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, etc. So when I wrote this book, it was to give people an understanding of antiquity. You know what's fascinating, we'll talk about it later, the giants, you cannot separate the giants from the little creatures. It's just absolutely phenomenal to me. So I've gone from one extreme to the other. I've gone from some of the tallest people in history, for instance, Polyphemus, which was a Cyclops that antiquity quotes. I used to think 400 feet was a little bit off until I found out, wait, there are people who are who are contemporaries in ancient Greece and Rome that acknowledge that as if it were fact, even to the point of having some of his bones. So from the standpoint of giants to little creatures, it's a full spectrum. And as you've been in the desert Southwest, the Hopi tradition of the ant people, and the ant people who save, you know, the normal human being. So in Wyoming, there was a whole tribe of little ones, like 6 inches to 12 inches, and Pedro the Mountain Mummy, that sounds like somebody made it up on a, you know, science fiction movie, but his actual mummy was basically held for all to see until someone stole it. There seems to be an interesting phenomenon going on, Tom, that everywhere any artifacts relating either to the giants show up or now the little people, whether it's the Nari Pond in Thailand, the Menhuni or the Menhuni in Hawaiian Islands, Indonesia, we heard about, obviously the hobbits. We're seeing all of the preconceived, what I would say, dishonest scientific findings, especially as it relates to anthropology and archaeology, being proven to be frauds. In other words, the spin they put on it is not what history records.
You know, we're talking about two things. We're talking about portals, doorways, and these are just words we put on them. Stargate, doorway, whatever. We're talking about a dimensional area through which something is entering into and exiting out of.
Correct.
Our three-dimensional understanding, or 4 dimensions if you add time. Why is time important? Because without time, nothing exists. You can't observe the 3 dimensions unless you have time. But anyway, moving in and out of this reality. But there's a verse that talks about both. In Revelation, these trumpets start sounding, these doors start opening. There are powerful angels that have keys to the doorways, but then there's stuff that's behind this doorway. So there's 2 different things. There's the entities, and then there's the methodology that they have for entering and exiting. And there, in Revelation 6:8, it's interesting because it starts talking about the 4th rider, and it starts talking about how he has the power to kill. And very interesting text. I'd like to get your feedback sometime on how it says he has the power to kill with death. Well, if you're already dead, how is he killing you with death? So this is talking about Thanatos. It's talking about something else is going on there. But it also says that he kills with the beasts of the earth, and that's the Greek therion, which can be interpreted as little creatures, as tiny destructive forces.
Demons, imps, we hear words like imps from hell. His behavior was impish. In studying and in writing this, and by the way, it's got enough footnotes in it that anybody will be happy if they want to go beyond even what I've written. One thing leads to another, but as you go into this, there are no kind little creatures. Most people who are dealing with Santa Claus and dealing with the little elves, etc., if they understood the roots. See, here's what I believe both you and I are doing. There's so much fruit of evil out there. We can see it on TV. People are experiencing it, but they don't go to the root of the matter. Every single thing we're dealing with now is there's nothing new under the sun. Obviously, Solomon said that. But he who controls the past determines the future. Now, let me define that. If you wanted to present a false worldview that was anti-biblical to ultimately set up a certain group of people at a certain time in history to believe the biggest lie and the ultimate deception, you would control all the truth in order to spin it, twist it, or basically just avoid it, but you'd put your spin on it. It's kind of like, I guess, in a liar's world, even they appreciate the Hegelian dialectic. They create a problem, they provide their solution, and providing their solution, they take away everything that people could have in free will. But this all even gets into transhumanism, and we won't go there right now. But the fascinating thing about, just as the alien phenomenon, when I'm talking about the alien phenomenon, we are talking about that which is usually attributed to extraterrestrials. You and I are on record extra-dimensionals. But they're always involved with sex. These little guys, okay, are always involved with sex. The changelings, for instance, they didn't have the ability by their fallen nature to produce normal children, so they would steal the normal kids and insert, if you will, their biological attempt at it, and that's the word changeling. Well, when you get into Native America, then you get into, obviously, the whole concept, the spirit beings that could take on any single form or shape they desire.
shapeshifters, because like there's locations here in the U.S. The Bradshaw Ranch is one of them over by Sedona. Of course, the famous Skinwalker Ranch.
Right.
And the guy that bought that ranch and closed it so that the public can't get in there has got giant contracts with the military. These are people, though, that you tend to find that they're highly connected in the military industrial complex. They're highly connected to some of the highest placed intelligence people in the nation, and yet they're actually trying to conjure and bring these things into this reality. The Babylon working is one of the things I'm referring to, but there's a long history of that connection of people who have super high IQs. They're very intelligent. They're not doing this because they're dumb, right? They're total believers. They believe more than a lot of the people in the church do about the supernatural, and they're attempting to bring themselves into contact. In fact, during some of these shows, maybe we'll talk about CERN and what are they trying to do at CERN. But you mentioned the succubus and you mentioned the incubus, and for people that are watching this program that don't know what that even means, why don't you explain who those are?
An incubus is a demon that takes on the male form and basically has sex with a human being. A succubus is a demon that takes on a female form that is sex with a male. In other words, incubus into females, succubus with males. Now, what's interesting about that is that, again, I mentioned earlier on the interview, Psalm 91. The thing is that people don't get it. These, when Paul says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. You and I have done shows on that, taken each one of those words, broken it down into the Greek, and explained what it is. The problem is God's people, who should be the most supernaturally endued with power from upon high, people have just basically sold out to the powers of darkness. And, you know, when Jesus said, "Get thee behind me, Satan," I have an interesting revelation on that. One day it came to me, this is what I heard in my spirit. When my people do not go forth with my word, the devil comes in with his word. Wow. And when he said, "Get thee behind me, Satan," that means no matter what I do, no matter what you do, we're presenting truth. But the devil will be right there saying, those guys are crazy, don't listen to them. There's always that challenge to the word of God, always. Hath God said. You and I talked about the goal, and this has everything to do with little creatures. The goal of the transhumanist is basically to live forever, to basically be as gods, and it says, "Oh, you shall not surely die."
We are going to become gods. Period. If you don't like it, get off. You don't have to contribute. You don't have to participate. But if you're going to interfere with me becoming God, you're going to have big trouble. Then we'll have warfare. The only way you can prevent me in this 50 or is to kill me. If you kill me, I'll kill you.
See, this is what happens when you start to look at the root of a problem, then you can explain the fruit of a problem. And as long as people are complaining about the fruit, they'll never get to the root. Now, I believe God's going to expose that, for we have the Word of God that states there's nothing that's been hidden that isn't going to be made known and be revealed.
Well, and you know, you're talking about the institutionalized church is completely asleep today. You and I both were former leaders in the institutions. We both are outside
You're kind. I would say comatose unto death. Okay?
Well, but at the same time, there seems to be some hopeful signs that a lot of the people that have left the church are very hungry today for something that's real. They want the meat of the word. But a curious thing is also happening in that a lot of people who are not Christians, they might even call themselves atheists or agnostics, yet still have an explosive spiritual hunger today. And so you see that there's a whole revival of occultism. You know, where are some of the places that you've sent me some of these stories where there's a revival of fairies, you know, across Europe, I guess.
Great Britain.
Yeah. And people are going out in hundreds of little doorways that they're putting on. What's going on with that?
Well, Iceland, you can't even build a road, build a house, or build anything without basically going to the wee folk, okay? And the wee folk are literally the elves. My ancestors came from the Isle of Man, probably one of the most prolific fairy, elf-embracing, little creature-embracing islands is off the coast of England, Great Britain. So what's fascinating to me is that the acknowledgement, again, the acknowledgement of these little creatures. It's like this. And I want to make this clear. This is the most critical point I can get through, and I do it, I think, very well in this. There's hope in Jesus. God said his people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. You and I are both on that central theme, that if they have the knowledge of what's really going on, then they can build from the premise of truth. If they have no knowledge of what's going on, then they'll be basically destroyed by the lack of truth. And God says his people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, not because it's not being presented to him. And somebody says, well, I don't want to talk about that because that scares me. Well, the reason you're scared is because you're not recognizing that God wants to give you the antidote for fear, and that antidote is knowledge. I made a statement, it's really critical to understand, that by controlling the past, the powers that be, the Illuminati, Luciferians, whatever you want to call it, let's just call it the movement of Satan on planet Earth that will come into direct war with the living God, is designed to basically keep all truth away from us at all costs.
The fact that there's evidence, some kind of a revival, there's some kind of movement around the world today, and I find it strange that it's happening at the same time. There's big pits that are just appearing in Siberia, and scientists are baffled by it, and over there around what they call it, the
Norway
Norwegian
spiral.
Yeah, the spiral is so there's all kind of strange, kind of anomalous activity happening at exactly the same time that people are reporting an increase in the appearance of everything from the Loch Ness Monster to Bigfoot to a revival of fairies that are appearing. Strange stuff, right, going on. Well, you've written the book about it, of course, to respond to the issue, but to also provide the authoritative question. What does this have to do with the Bible? Is that even a biblical concept, little creatures and doorways and portals?
Well, absolutely. Jacob's ladder, great example. Jacob saw in his dream the angels ascending and descending, coming up or going up and going down the ladder. Paul talks about in his writings, the Apostle Paul talks about he knew a man once, whether in the spirit or out of the spirit, who was taken to the seventh heaven. Jesus appearing to the disciples and then walking right through, if you will, the walls. There's so many instances in the Old Testament and in the New Testament of that transition point between our plane of existence, which we call obviously life, and then death. And now it's interesting that death is now becoming the predominant theme in science fiction, whether it's the vampire movies or any of the science fiction, you've got to die. When we come to the whole idea of portals, I think it's interesting because the gates of hell is the greatest proof text in the New Testament that they will not prevail. But a gate doesn't basically do, it fulfills two functions. It holds something back or allows something through. It's like a giant time. The book of Daniel talks about knowledge would increase dramatically, run to and fro, but that seal it up, Daniel, for the appointed time. We've talked about that. And it seems like God has given you a combination. We're dealing with this massive time lock. And now the locks are starting to open. And I believe CERN is the master lock. And as that master lock is opened, it's going to like key all the other locks. Let's say you're dealing with a 6-point locking mechanism when CERN goes, and what's the real purpose of CERN? Look, these guys, these entities, and I'm convinced that the intelligence of the scientific community is being supernaturally enhanced for this time in history to allow these fallen angels, the ones that basically have been, if you will, banished, and all of the powers of darkness to come through. Now, the word creatures is interesting because in the book of Giants are Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's on my website, steekwell.com, and I know you're going to print it pretty soon, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, along with the books of Isaiah and all the different fragments of the Old Testament, the Book of Giants is one of the most overlooked. Everybody will quote the Book of Enoch, but in the Book of Giants, it specifically states the fallen angels corrupted all of creation. The word for creation, obviously, that which derives from creation would be creatures. So the point is that we're talking about evil creatures with sentience. We're talking about strange, how do I say this, morphed entities and combined entities like Saturns or chimeras coming back on the scene. And most people would be fascinated to find out that in antiquity, they collected the bones of the giants. They collected the bones of unicorns. They collected this stuff. And believe me, I'm not talking about rainbow unicorns. I'm talking about the real things. And so now we're in a position where that which had been forbidden for mankind, and God literally locked them up, okay? In one place in the Old Testament, God says, you want filth? I'm going to pour you out about filth. In the book of Jude, we see the filthy dreamers, and filthy dreamers, and ties back into incubus and succubus. And so there are portals. Now we see people again getting fascinated with a Ouija board. A Ouija board is the most evil contact point that children and adults can harmlessly get into a world of hell they never even bargained for, because it's a very dangerous thing. So there are portals all around. Fast forward, Tom, you know, from our generation, and look at what's going on. Kids are living in a virtual world. They're being programmed with monsters and every form of demonic hybrids. They're basically battling the forces of hell, but then now good is frowned upon and evil is absolutely elevated. Woe unto them who call good evil and evil good. That's what the prophet, that drove, I believe, Jeremiah crazy, you know?
Well, and you know, you brought up the issue of CERN. So it's interesting that the Scripture has always acknowledged that there are doorways. You mentioned some of them in other radio shows you've done. You've talked about Jonah going down into the bottom of the sea. The Hebrew there, Baravak, a city of gates. A gate opens.
Right.
What does he goes through the gate and he winds up in Sheol, Hades. He winds up in the center of the earth. Jesus goes there later and brings back the keys to some of those gateways. So now we know that not only do gates and doorways exist, they have keys to them. Of course, Revelation 9, and a star falls down from heaven with a key to the bottomless pit. And it also illustrates that the earth is dynamic in ways that the average person out there isn't even thinking about. They get in their car, right, and drive to Walmart. They're not even thinking about the crust that they're driving over the top of, and what the Bible tells us is inside of the earth itself. Recent studies showing isotopic signals coming up from underneath the crust of the earth, echoing back to a former world that once existed and was driven underground by some impact of the earth. What was that? The fall of Lucifer? We find now there's an ocean under the surface of the earth that has 3 times as much water as all the surface oceans. So the earth is so much more dynamic than most people understand, but it has those creatures in it that you've been talking about, many of them. But this is also part of prophecy, because prophecy also talks about the day when those gates are going to open. And many of those fearsome things that are inside the earth are going to be let out. Well, folks, Pan was a horned goat type being. He was the one that was being worshipped down there at the base of Mount Hermon in Caesarea Philippi when Jesus stood there and said, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. So there's this constant reference, there's this constant acknowledgement that there is a warfare, there is a battle going on with what most people would say, those are just mythological beings. They never existed. They never walked on the earth. There's no such thing, right? That's what they say.
That's what they say. I remember almost 20 years ago, Tom, posting a story and talking about the story that was posted. It was on the BBC that the tomb of Gilgamesh was found. Gilgamesh was half man, half god. He was a fallen, he was a giant. And he went into the underworld, and he had to have the key to the underworld. But they were actually actively looking for his DNA. Now, I want to propose something. I don't know that anybody outside of you and I have ever talked about this, but suppose all of the most evil people in the world, the world's, let's say, the who's who from hell, whether you name it, Genghis Khan or some of the emperors under the old dynasties of China. I mean, some of those guys killed 20 and 30 million people. Imagine the worst people in history being cloned. Now, because I want to share something, Jesus talked when an evil spirit goes out, it goes and wanders in the dark places, and it comes back to see if its habitation is fit for repossession. So imagine that there are people out there that are sold out to the powers of darkness that literally want to bring back some of the most malevolent / human beings that have ever been demon possessed. And imagine this, that they would actually become repossessed with the same spirit that left when they died, which brings us to the difference of most people confuse 3 words. They confuse the word Nephilim, they confuse the word Rephaim, which is synonymous with giants, and demon, okay? Now, why I think this is so critical is because everything has become a Nephilim. A giant is not a Nephilim. The word Nephilim appears twice in the Old Testament, once before the flood and once after the flood. Book of Genesis, chapter 6, and then Leviticus 13:33. And then when you go into the dead things from under the earth are formed, that word dead in Hebrew is either Rephaim or Rapha, and it refers specifically to the giants. Then you go to the demons, and as you know from the book of Enoch and the book of Giants, the demons were the disembodied spirits of the giants. And so when those disembodied spirits, in other words, a giant was half fallen angel, half human. Those were hybrids. That's why God told Israel to go in and kill every man, woman, and child, because they were not created in his image or likeness. You go to the book of Genesis, and God's very clear, after its kind and likeness, after its kind and likeness. And he saw that it was good. Devil comes along and destroys that genome. He wants the last vestige of humanity destroyed. And Jesus said, if those days weren't shortened, and for the elect's sake they will be short, there'd be no flesh left alive. So the goal of the enemy, even now, through genetic manipulation, through transhumanism, through all of the isms that are out there, is to do away with humanity. And basically, they shake their fist in the face of a living God and say, you didn't do a good enough job. We don't need you. We'll live forever. We don't need you for anything, God. I think the Lord's about ready to call their cards. I don't play cards, but what's it called when you call somebody?
The bluff, yeah.
Their bluff, okay? He's about ready. And I think the bottom line is that people have got to understand. When the Lord himself said, men's hearts failing them for fear of looking after those things coming upon the earth, notice up on the earth. Upon means to literally come up on. We've got to deal with the, I guess you'd call the devil's sandwich. We've got fallen angels coming, the war in heaven, the devil's being kicked out, you know, and he inhabits the second heaven right now. Woe unto you inhabitants of earth when he comes down onto the earth. Then we got everything coming up on the earth. But the great news is Jesus said you don't have to be afraid of it. He said you don't have to. He said, I've given you the keys. Isn't that a wonderful promise?
That's right.
God's given us the promise. And the Bible says that we overcome the devil in all of it by the blood of the Lamb, the word of our testimony, we love not our life unto death. That means that God has more than given us provision.
Right, and you know, it's interesting that you bring this point out, and it's important actually for true believers to know that when we're talking about these little creatures and this stuff that's coming upon the earth and men's hearts failing them for fear, the very same text, like in Revelation, the pit opens and this demonic locust horde starts coming up out of the earth, but then what does God say? But do not touch those who have the seal of God upon them. So isn't that a great message?
It is a great message, but God didn't say, oh, forget about those things coming upon the earth, you know. You see, again, the problem with the people of God is they don't take him at his word, and they don't take him seriously. I'd like to make sure everybody's got a red letter Bible. Red letter Bible, as you know, that's the words of Jesus.
Right.
Jesus is talking the one about men's hearts failing them for fear. And God has not given us a spirit of fear. And so people say, well, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind. My answer to them most of the time is, then why are you afraid? Because people are absolutely, the first thing they'll do with truth is reject it, okay? Second thing they'll do is attack the messenger. Third thing they'll do is basically get everybody to agree with them so they have a justification for fear. And then the fourth thing they'll finally do is, well, maybe we'll admit that this stuff might exist. Well, between might exist and happening to you, that's the great chasm, and only the blood of Jesus can make it real.
Hey, Steve, we got about 3 minutes, Steve, and I want to ask you something real quick. A moment ago, you mentioned, you know, this cloning. They're going to start cloning the woolly mammoth. But the first thing that came into my mind, some research that maybe we'll start talking about on this program, and if you come back, we'll finish talking about on the next program. But you know, they got this woolly mammoth out of the ice there in Alaska. There have been other things that have come up out of the ice. There's actually a very rich history that you've talked about before, having to do with the Nazis and what they were doing, activity that was going on there. We don't have a lot of time, maybe in 2 minutes or less. What else do you think may have been brought out of the ice that would have clonable DNA?
Well, I'll turn 2 minutes into an eternity of facts, okay? The point being is that what we were talking about earlier is Antarctica and the absolute fascinating history associated with New Schwabenland, the Empire of Ice, the area that's underneath the massive ice. And it's interesting because during you'll love this, this will really date me, but during the late 50s into the early 60s, the old movie actor Doug McClure made about, I think, 3 or 4 movies where basically he gets on a German U-boat and goes in under the ice. Well, Admiral Byrd talked about that, and there was actually a war in the South Atlantic, and most people don't realize this, in 1947, involving flying saucers, involving time dilation, involving everything. And for most people have got to understand, we'll talk about this, maybe do a whole show on it, but science fiction is the Illuminati's way of telling their adherents what they've gotten stored and what they've got planned. So what's fascinating, Tom, is if people want to just do a quick search and go on my website, and under topics, I think I got so many pages, I got to make sure I know where it's at. It sometimes baffles me where it's at, but it's Operation High Jump, and that was the official military name, Operation High Jump. So it's critical that people understand that, because we're talking about genetic manipulation. Chris Carter in the X-Files movie absolutely staged part of the end of the movie in the Antarctic, and I've been told by generals and special operations that there are parts of that are true, and there are other parts that obviously they can't tell. Well, I think that time is going to tell, and I want to say this to everybody. Jesus promised there's nothing that's hidden that isn't going to be made known. So we're going to show people that we're kind of like shoehorns, putting into their feet the ability to walk in those paths of knowledge and understanding and be able to give people answers for the stuff that's going to overwhelm people.
Well, folks, as you can see, once again, every time I get together with Steve, we have the hardest time in the world getting everything that can be said in a very concise period of time. This guy's brain never shuts down. You can see why I love being with him. But if we can, I guess we're just going to have to do another television program, because I want to come back to that, because you said a moment ago something about, what they might reanimate. That's been, and I said Alaska, I meant Antarctica, that's been brought out of Antarctica. But you and I also have a little curious history with Franz Josef Land. Maybe we'll start there in the next program. Tom Horn with my good friend Steve Quayle. Thank you for joining us today on Skywatch TV.